Hi YouTube, and welcome to the channel today. So today we're going to be looking at the verses in 1 Corinthians 7:15 and Romans 7 verses 2 to 3. So we're going to be discussing the word bound, which is used in both these verses. So often the word not bound in 1 Corinthians 7:15 is taken to mean that the marriage covenant is now broken, null and void, and being not bound or not enslaved, as it's rightly translated, this doesn't indicate that the marriage covenant is terminated, and it definitely doesn't indicate that you're free to remarry. So these verses in 1 Corinthians 7:15, actually let me just read the verses. Let me just read the verse. So 1 Corinthians 7:15, if the unbelieving spouse leaves, the believer is not bound in such circumstances, but called to peace. So this verse is often used for people who want to get remarried after their partner's left them. They've been deserted, so they take not bound to mean that the marriage is over, finished, and it's terminated. But this is just not true. I mean, it doesn't take much, really, Bible study to see that this is not what not bound in this verse means. So if we look at Romans 7, 2 to 3, which is a verse that people often refer back to, basically these verses say, for the woman which has a husband is bound by the law to her husband so long as he lives, but if he is dead she is loosed from the law of her husband. So then if while her husband's alive she marries another man, she shall be called an adulteress, but if her husband is dead she is free from that law, so she is not an adulteress, even if she marries another man. So anyone who wants to try and get out of a marriage by using 1 Corinthians 7:15 will refer back to these verses where it says a woman which has a husband is bound by the law. So the argument is, if 1 Corinthians 7:15 says you're not bound, and Romans 7 verses 2 to 3 says you are bound, then these two words are the same. So taking it from that, 1 Corinthians 7:15 is therefore taken to mean that you're not bound to the marriage. But if we look at the words that are used in these two verses, so bound by the law in Romans 7, 2 to 3, the word used is deo, which means to tie together, to fasten, almost like it says to fasten with chains even. So it's something that is like you're tied together. It's something that you can't break free from. Whereas if you look at the word in 1 Corinthians 7:15 for bound, it's actually enslaved is the word. So you're not enslaved. So actually what the verse is saying is that if an unbelieving partner leaves, you're not enslaved. It's not saying that the marriage is terminated. It's not saying that the covenant comes to an end. It's saying you're not enslaved to that person anymore. So if we take a look at the passages, the verses before 1 Corinthians 7:15, we can see Paul saying in verse 11, a wife must not separate from her husband, but if she does, she must remain unmarried or reconciled to her husband, and a husband must not divorce his wife. Then in verses 12 to 13, again, Paul is emphasising that divorce should be avoided. So why then, in verse 15, would he suddenly backtrack on the above verses and say, hey, it's okay to divorce and remarry if your spouse leaves you? And the passages don't even say your spouse, they say your unbelieving spouse. A lot of people in church, a lot of Christians will use these verses to say, if you're deserted, you can divorce and remarry, even if your wife or husband is a Christian. This verse is not saying that. This verse is saying, if your unbelieving spouse leaves, you're not enslaved to them anymore. So anyone that's been married to an unbeliever will understand what that means. So if you're a believer married to an unbeliever, either because you married them as an unbeliever or you became converted after you were married. So if you're married to an unbeliever, it's not easy to live with an unbeliever. So living with an unbeliever definitely restricts your ability to serve God. In your everyday life, it definitely restricts your ability to express your faith in your home, to play Christian music, to invite Christian friends around, to pray, to get your Bible out even, to have Christian books in the house. You can't control, if you're living with an unbeliever, what they bring into your home. you know, who they bring into your home, how they speak, what they watch on TV, what they watch on Netflix, you know, what they're teaching your kids or what they're not teaching your kids. You know, it's really difficult living with an unbeliever. But as Christians, you know, we want to keep the peace, don't we? So when we're living with if we're living with an unbeliever, we're trying to keep the peace, but it doesn't work really. It's a really difficult situation, because you're trying to keep the peace with someone who perhaps doesn't want to keep the peace with you and is quite enjoying the fact that they're like restricting your faith and making you feel like you can't be who God's called you to be. It's very difficult to live with an unbeliever. So if the unbeliever leaves, Paul knows how difficult it is for people to live with an unbeliever. If you're a believer, if you're a true born again Christian, and he's saying to you, you're not enslaved anymore, because some believers would feel they need to run after that person, they need to try and make them come back. I mean, yes, we should try and reconcile our marriages, but not to the extent where it's like taking over our lives and we feel guilty because we have to get them back. And you know, we feel that it's our responsibility to do everything we can to save the marriage and go above and beyond sometimes and put ourselves in emotionally and mentally and spiritually difficult places by trying to force an issue with an unbeliever who's left, who doesn't want to come home. Paul's clearly saying here that we're not enslaved anymore to do that. You know, basically we've been called to peace. So this peace will come sooner or later if we're obedient. So if an unbelieving partner leaves, Jesus is very clear that all remarriage is adultery while your husband or wife, your first husband or wife, is alive. So if all remarriage is adultery, in these verses, in this verse 1 Corinthians 7:15, Paul is not saying that you can get remarried. Why would he say that when Jesus clearly calls remarriage adultery? And he's clearly said before, in the verses before, that, you know, he's never mentioned remarriage. Whenever Paul talks about marriage, he sees it as lifelong, and he himself calls remarriage adultery. In Romans 7 verse 2-3, so a woman is an adulteress if she gets married again. She gets divorced and gets remarried. And 1 Corinthians 7:10-11, a woman needs to remain unmarried or be reconciled, because if she gets married again, she will be committing adultery. Paul is really clear about that. So he's not going to be saying in this verse that not bound, not enslaved, means the marriage is over, the marriage is broken, and you can go off and get remarried. Also, I wanted to add here that a man who remarries also commits adultery. It's not just the woman. So Matthew 5:31, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. Luke 16 verse 18, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries her that is divorced from her husband commits adultery. Mark 10 verse 11-12, and Jesus said to them, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her, and if a woman divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. So we can see that either a man or a woman who divorces their wife commits adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced man or woman also commits adultery. It's very obvious from the teachings of Jesus and Paul that remarriage, while a first covenant spouse is alive, is always adultery. So the Christian walk is not an easy walk. We just have to look at the life of Christ, the life of the disciples, the life of the early Christians. You know, the Christian walk is not an easy walk. I guess living in the West, it pretty much is an easy walk for most Christians. You know, we're not threatened with death on a daily basis. We get to live quite a comfortable life. We get to pick and choose, you know, what we do with our time, what we do with our jobs. You know, we get to pick and choose how many times we can get divorced and remarried if we're not happy with our spouse. We get to live in sin, like many Christians these days live in sin. You know, it's easy come, easy go Christianity mainly in the West, but that isn't what real Christianity is about. And if we want to practice living for Christ in the area of marriage, divorce and remarriage, then that will mean that we will live according to his revealed will. And that's not easy, because basically if your spouse leaves you, you're called to stay single or reconcile. Hang on, let me just get the verse. Yeah, it's 1 Corinthians 7, 10-11. And to the married I command, yet not I but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband, but if she departs, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. So Paul said that, you know, he didn't say if your marriage breaks up, you can go off and get remarried. Nowhere in the New Testament does Paul or Jesus say that. They say the exact opposite. So it's not an easy walk. So if you're separated, your spouse has left you, or maybe he's been abusive to you, maybe your wife's left you and took your kids, which is horrible, but there isn't anywhere in the Bible that says because you've been treated badly, or because your marriage only lasted 3 months, or because you married in haste. And there's nowhere in the Bible that says once a covenant marriage, a first marriage between a man and a woman who don't have a previous covenant living spouse, once that marriage has taken place, there's no other way that that marriage comes to an end but by death. That's the clear teachings of Jesus and Paul. So that means, we're going to have to stay on our own. And that's not fashionable, is it? It's not cool. It's not okay, really, to live like that, I found anyway, in the church, because there isn't really anyone else doing that. Normally, if you get divorced, you get remarried, and everyone in the church comes to your wedding, and everyone's bringing you presents and sending you messages saying how wonderful it is, that you've got a second chance. I don't ever hear these verses mentioned in these situations. It's just taken now. That's it. That's the way it is in church. If you get divorced, even if you're the one that commits adultery, you can go off, marry someone else. You can go off and marry the person you committed adultery with. The church is still going to give you a blessing. It's still going to marry you. But, with no thought for the first husband or wife left behind, when the Bible clearly speaks that marriage, in God's eyes, is still intact. The church is away on this issue. So this business of living in peace, so this is really sort of disregarded, really. You never really hear anyone talking about this. But, you really are called to peace. So once you've got over the initial heartbreak and being abandoned and rejected and having to raise your kids on your own, perhaps if you're a woman, or once you've been thrown out of the house if you're a man and you can't see your kids, and I'm not underestimating how hard it's been, because I've done it for 20 years. It's not easy. But once you get past that and stay faithful to God, stay obedient, stay basically in God's eyes, he still sees you as married. So once you get over that initial hurt and the difficulties, which is horrible, God will bring you into a place of peace where you can live at peace. Now, the world says you need to be in a relationship. The world says that you need to have a new husband or wife or a new family. The world is geared towards couples. Tell me about it. And it's just not really the done thing to stay on your own, or to say that it's okay to be on your own. But I think there's even another verse, isn't it, in the Bible where I think it's Paul that says, it's the best thing really if you cannot get married if possible, because he knows how hard marriage is. And the other thing with being unmarried or living as a single person, if your husband or wife has left you, if you've got no choice, is you're free to serve the Lord full time with your life. And God will give you a calling. He will raise you up. This is not an accident. If this has happened to you, this is not an accident. He has got something for you to do. I don't know what it could be, but he will reveal it to you as you walk with him. He will reveal your calling to you, even if you are having to live on your own. In fact, you're more likely to be able to walk out your calling if you are living on your own. And with this, in time comes peace, comes this amazing sense of deep, abiding peace and shalom inside that you just can't put words to. An incredible sense of joy. You wake up in the morning and you're full of joy. You have no idea why, because you're living on your own. Maybe you've not done well out of the divorce and you haven't got any money, you haven't got anywhere secure to live perhaps, but you wake up with this abiding sense of joy, because this is the upside down kingdom. This is how God works. If we put him first, at great cost to ourselves, he will honour us. Honestly, it won't be how we think we should be blessed, with financial prosperity, a loving husband or wife, a nice family, lots of friends, and all the normal things that people think are good in life. God doesn't work like that. So what he gives you is better than that. What he gives you is a peace in your heart, a focus, a purpose. You know your calling, you know your destiny, you know what he wants you to do, and you can do it. And he gives you the tools to be able to live out what he's called you to do. And with that comes this abiding sense of peace within, of knowing you're in his will for your life. So all this can come to you, even if you're the one that has been abandoned or has been thrown out, because marriage still stands, and all the verses in the New Testament back this up. Marriage still stands. Marriage is once and once only, and if you're obedient to that, even if your spouse is gone, then you will get blessings from God. You will get peace, and he will give you what to do. Then no one else can, and I don't know what that is, but that's God. He's not going to just forget about you and leave you just sat there with no one and nothing and feeling bereft and abandoned and alone. He's not going to do that. I'm not saying it's easy, and it might take time, but that's what he wants to do. That's what he is willing to do for you. But we have to play our part, which is we have to deny ourselves and our needs and what we might think that we want, and put him first. And when we start putting him first and living according to what the Bible says and how we should live when we're divorced or separated, that's when things change. And that's when we feel his presence. He comes to us in such a mighty way, and our lives around for the good, because he always does that for everyone and anyone who puts him first. Particularly, God knows, if it's been at great cost that you've done that, then you will get an even greater blessing. Don't listen to most of the church. Don't definitely listen to the world. Listen to God. Listen to his word. Live by that, and he will reward you. And even if he doesn't, we're not living for this life, are we? We're dead to this life. We're living for the next. We're living for him in this life. Our greatest rewards are going to come in the next life, not in this life. Anyway, I think I want to end here. I want to say thank you for listening, and we can see clearly actually from 1 Corinthians 7:15 that what Paul is talking about here is when an unbelieving spouse leaves you, that you're not enslaved to them anymore. He's not saying that the marriage is broken, that the covenant has ended. He's not saying that you're free to remarry. He's saying that you're not enslaved to them anymore. You can live single, unmarried, or try and reconcile with your spouse. And if that doesn't work, then God has called you to peace. So yeah, thank you for listening.